For those of you who don't know me, I'm Corinne Cafado, Vice President of the Library Foundation. The Foundation would like to thank all of those who have been making donations to the Foundation. This helps the Foundation bring many events like this evening to our community. Tonight we are welcoming back Stephen Puleo, who's an author, historian, teacher, public speaker, and communications professional. He has written 6 narrative nonfiction books and has a 7th on its way to be published in the spring of 2020. The books he has written so far: American Treasures, The Caning, A City So Grand, The Boston Italians, which is my favorite, Youth Enemy Action, and Dark Tide. Steve's books have been well received in the Boston regional area as well as national recognition. He has been written about in the New Yorker, the Boston Globe, Parade Magazine, the Portland Herald, Press Herald, the Library Journal Book List, History.com, as well as numerous accolades on the radio and television. Many of his books have been woven into the curriculum of numerous high schools and colleges. More than 20 communities have selected his book as the community read for the students. Steve also conducts book clubs tours of the Boston North End, one of the nation's most colorful and historic neighborhoods. He has been a keynote speaker at the Northeast Regional Association of Social Studies, a guest for the 150th anniversary celebration at the Massachusetts Superior Court, and a participation with the Italian American and Jewish American scholars entitled Italy and the Holocaust, the Calabria collection, which was presented at UMass Boston. And he has been a speaker at the National Archives and the National Constitution Center on his book, American Treasures. Tonight, Steve will be talking about the Dark Tide, which is very timely since it's been 100 years since the Molasses flood took place in Boston. Please join me in welcoming Steve Puleo.
Thanks, Corinne. Thank you. Thanks, Corinne. Thanks, you guys, for being here. The mic is working in the back row? Great. Awesome. I was thinking when I walked in here, I think this is my 4th time in Hanson. So thanks for the invitation. Except the last 3 times, the room was turned around. Right? Is that right? Yes. I spoke up there and talked back here. So but this works. I think we might even have more people in the room with the room turned this way. So it's great. Exciting week for me. Corinne mentioned the 100th anniversary of the Molasses flood was Tuesday. Had a big event at the Boston Public Library. I just talked to 2 people who were at that event. Very exciting. They're going to come back and hear a lot of the same stuff tonight, but they said the questions would be different, and I'm sure that is the case. So it's been exciting. We've had good national, international coverage of Dark Tide, of the Molasses flood. Seems to be capturing people's imagination across the country. School kids, engineers, judges, teachers, lawyers, rescue people, hazmat people, all of those kind of folks seem to be really excited about the story. So that's been wonderful for me. Dark Tide's been out for 15 years. I saw a couple people with hardcovers. Thank you so much. That's a early adopters. I really appreciate that. The paperback came out, hardcover 03, paperback in 04. Brand new 100th anniversary paperback edition with a new afterword by me. Just came out this week, so that's the book that's here for sale. If you'd like to pick that up, great. If not, see you later. No, just kidding. Totally, whatever you'd like to do is great. I thought what I'd do tonight is what I generally do. I have a few things to talk about. I want to talk about the flood, the making of Dark Tide, the whole, kind of that whole story. And at the end of this, we'll do questions and answers. When we get to the Q&A, believe me, as I said the other night, it's really my favorite part of these presentations. I really enjoy that interaction. So when we get to the Q&A, please feel free to ask anything about the book, the story, the publishing, writing, research, any of that kind of thing. And we'll have a little fun when that happens, I think. Does that work for everybody? Good. Awesome. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Dark Tide and the flood and where it fits in history. All of those important big history issues that touch this story, and plus the drama and the narrative of this story, which I think is pretty amazing, pretty unusual. I would say probably the most unusual disaster story you can imagine. but every word of it is true. Sounds like a television trailer, you know? But think about this story and how I tried to put it into Dark Tide and how Dark Tide works. My book works on two levels, right? There's a dramatic narrative on level one. This is a 10-year story, a 10-year saga. Starts with the construction of this large molasses holding tank on Boston's Commercial Street waterfront in the North End in the fall of 1915. And it ends in April of 1925 with the massive court case, civil lawsuit that happens after the flood, that comes to an end when the judge in the case rules against the company that owns the tank. Huge, landmark, major case, I think, in American history, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And in that 10-year saga is everything that you might expect in a dramatic narrative, right? The fact that the tank was rushed to completion with very little oversight and built in a shoddy manner. The fact that it leaked from day one, long 50-foot leaks down the side of the tank. The fact that it moaned and groaned and shuddered every time there was a delivery of molasses. So much so that the DPW workers working nearby, the firefighters working nearby, the children that would come onto the site nearby could hear it after deliveries. The collapse and the disaster itself, 21 people killed, 150 people injured, enormous property damage in Boston's North End, really harrowing kinds of injuries and deaths, so a real tragedy. The scenes at the hospital afterwards, surreal kinds of scenes, doctors and nurses and how they respond to the victims. The cleanup effort, which is massive, and then this court case, which is really an incredible kind of case. One of the largest civil lawsuits in Massachusetts history, still one of the first class action lawsuits in the state, and one of the first times that a large US corporation was ruled against. So that's kind of the dramatic level that works. But for me, what really makes this story interesting, what really makes this a big part of history, is that almost every major issue that America was dealing with in this early part of the 20th century, 100 years ago, quite literally touches this story in a very direct way. Now, there's lots of nonfiction books that you'll read where the author will talk about the event and kind of set the scene around it, what's happening geographically, what's happening culturally, politically, all of that. But I was pretty amazed when I was doing this research that every one of these major issues touches the flood story. What do I mean by that? Well, think about it. World War I and munitions, big part of Dark Tide, weaves its way through all of Dark Tide. Why is that important? Because about 90% of the molasses that's stored in the tank and then further processed into industrial alcohol is also processed one more time and is used in the production of munitions for the First World War. Nitroglycerin, TNT, other high explosives. United States Industrial Alcohol, the company that owns the tank, private company with United States in the name, has as its major customers large munitions companies around the country, the British and French governments early in the war, and when the US gets into the war in 1917, the US government becomes a large client of US industrial alcohol. Molasses is the raw material that's used in this munitions production. It is a protected government industry. And so this World War I and munitions theme works its way through Dark Tide, quite literally touches this story. The anarchist movement, issue number 2. The anarchists during this period of American history, very active, very violent. And these are anarchists of all nationalities. But the Italian anarchist movement, essentially the comrades of Sacco and Vanzetti and Luigi Galliani, etc., has as its de facto headquarters, national headquarters, Boston's North End. Lots of activity. They bomb munitions plants. They blow up a police station on Salutation Street in the North End, 1916. They're really active, really busy. Why is that important? because United States Industrial Alcohol makes as the cornerstone of its defense. They argue that an anarchist snuck onto the tank property and dropped a pipe bomb down the vent pipe, one of the 4 vent pipes on the roof of the tank, to blow the tank up, and therefore they should be absolved of all liability. Now, they have no evidence for that. The judge kind of tells them that at the end of the court case. But it is a strong and eloquent circumstantial case that they put on, made stronger by the fact that in April of 1919, just a few months after the flood, anarchists send package bombs through the mail to about 35 high-ranking government and business officials around the country. Most of those are intercepted. And in June of 1919, just 5 months after the flood, anarchists explode 7 bombs simultaneously in cities across the United States, including Washington, D.C., at the Attorney General of the United States home, Mitchell Palmer, responsible for the Palmer raids and deportations. Pretty harrowing stuff, right? A bomb goes off at the Attorney General of the United States home. And then just as Attorney Charles Choate is beginning his defense of U.S. industrial alcohol. Charles Choate, who goes on to form Choate, Hall & Stewart, by the way, big law firm in Boston. Just as Charles Choate is about to begin his opening argument in the court case in September of 1920, a bomb explodes on Wall Street in New York City in front of J.P. Morgan's headquarters, kills 42 people. Anarchist bomb in New York City. So it's almost a kind of a fortuitous, circumstantial event for Choate as he's beginning his opening statement. And so that anarchist theme works its way through Dark Tide. Number 3, the immigration theme. Immigration, very controversial issue in 1919, as it is today. Some of the same reasons, some different reasons. But in this story, I think it's important because if you look at the North End at this time, in 1919, the North End is about, I would say, 98% Italian. Most of the Irish population has moved out. Most of the Jewish population has moved out, save for small pockets of each. The Italians who live there, about 40,000 strong in about a square mile of inhabitable space. Hello, you guys are in Hanson, lots of space. But about 40,000, what do you guys have, 10,000 people in Hanson? Ballpark? Yeah. Okay, so 40,000 people in about a square mile of inhabitable space if you do not count the warehouses right on the Commercial Street waterfront, which are now very expensive condos, but anyway. And these 40,000 Italians who live there, probably about 60% of them are still not citizens. They can't vote thus, and they have very little to say about what goes on in their own neighborhood. Very little to say. So when the tank is sighted on the Commercial Street waterfront in one of the most congested neighborhoods in the entire United States, and by the way, in one of the busiest commercial areas in the United States, that Commercial Street waterfront, where there was like a DPW yard, they called it the North End Paving Yard, a blacksmith shop, a carpentry shop, stables with about 25 horses, a firehouse on the end of the pier, which is on the cover of Dark Tide. Deliveries on that waterfront to ships that went up and down the East Coast and to Europe. Deliveries of produce, deliveries of leather, beer, all of that stuff that Boston exported. When it's placed there, this 50-foot tank, 50 feet tall, 5 stories, 90 feet in diameter, there's barely a whimper, right? Barely a whimper from the neighborhood and barely a whimper from the Boston political hierarchy. And when it starts to leak from day one, barely a whimper from the neighborhood and barely a whimper from the hierarchy. And even after it collapses, in a sense, there's a little outrage. Mayor Andrew Peters has a day or two of outrage. Honey Fitz, who's the congressman from the North End, a little bit of outrage. But it passes pretty quickly. So that whole theme of not having much control over what goes on in your own neighborhood, so vastly different from what we know today. Today, if you want to put a playhouse in your backyard, you have to have enough frontage, right? You have to have enough side yard, you have to go to the Board of Appeals, whatever you guys have here. I don't know if that's what it is, but you know, it's something we kind of almost take for granted today. not then. So this whole immigration theme kind of works its way through Dark Tide. And the fourth big one, and I think maybe the biggest, you know, we've talked World War I, we've talked anarchists, we've talked immigration. The fourth big one is this. When the judge in the case, U.W. Ogden, makes his decision and rules in favor of the 119 plaintiffs in the case, very ordinary people, basically Irish city workers and Italian immigrants. That's the vast majority of that 119. When he rules against it in 1925, it is one of the very first decisions that goes against a large United States corporation. And if you kind of draw a line in the sand from there on, the whole relationship between government and business changes. There are far more regulations, statutes, laws that business imposes on government in the late 20s after the stock market crash, and certainly into the early Roosevelt years in the 30s. Now, some people say the pendulum swings a little too far one way or a little too far the other in the intervening decades. Probably true. But there's no question that that molasses flood case kind of changes the dynamic of the relationship between government and business. And it comes at a time, why does that happen? It comes at a time, 1925, where think about what's going on in the country. It's a fairly prosperous economic time. Not in the North End, which is a poor neighborhood, but I'm just saying in general, it's a prosperous economic time. All of the smokestack industries are doing pretty well. Rubber, chemical, industrial alcohol, all doing pretty well. The auto industry is growing. First ads for newspapers appear first ads for automobiles appear in newspapers around 1922. So this is 1925. Things are starting to pick up. Consumers, they're buying things like toasters and irons for their homes for the first time in large numbers. There's capital available for people to buy money and invest in businesses. It's a pretty prosperous time. But at the same time, the country's trying to figure out how do we keep this economy going, but how do we make businesses more responsible for things like employee safety, public safety? This is around the time of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, about the Chicago meatpacking plants and some of the issues there, and all that swirling around. So when Judge Ogden makes his decision, it's a big deal. And moving forward, it's a big deal. To me, that's why this is a landmark case with lots of importance all the way up to the present day. And so what I try to do in Dark Tide is I try to weave those two levels together, that dramatic narrative level here, that big history level here, bring them together like that. I've had people say to me, the history goes down easy in this book. Anybody here actually read the book? Oh shoot. Listen, you've all read the book. What am I talking for? No. So I've had people say the history goes down easy, which I take as a compliment. I think that's how I think history should go down. That's how I think how I should write it. I think that's how you should expect to read it. But that's what I tried to do here, is let the story, the drama of the story, pull the big history along. I want you to learn the big history almost in spite of yourself. That's kind of my goal when I put this book together. And I also try to do that by telling the story through the eyes of real life characters. The characters in this book, for the most part, ordinary people. I mean, there's some people you'll know. President Woodrow Wilson's character, Sacco and Vanzetti are characters, but most of the major characters in Dark Tide are pretty ordinary folks, victims particularly. So I tried to tell their stories, and through their eyes, this big story. People like George Leahy, who's the firefighter, is trapped under the firehouse when the molasses wave slams in to the firehouse 80 feet away. The second floor pancakes down onto the first floor. Leahy's trapped under there with a few other firefighters. And for 4 hours tries to keep his head above molasses, and finally succumbs, dies, asphyxiates in molasses, drowns in molasses. Call it whatever you'd like. But through George Leahy, you kind of learn about the Irish experience. When he comes to Boston, when he moves out of the North End into East Boston, he takes the ferry across to do his work as a firefighter. You learn that he's a father of 3, just had an infant, he and his wife. So you learn a little bit about him while he's under there. I tell the story of the 2 children in the Molasses flood who died, both 10 years old. Maria D'Stasio and Pasquale in Tosca, children of Italian immigrants. They are home from school at lunchtime, custom of the day, collecting firewood in that tank area. Now, oftentimes they would go down there and scoop up pails of molasses that had pooled around the tank from the leaks. But on this day they were collecting firewood when the disaster occurs. Maria's body is found that afternoon. Firefighters spot just her hair swirling on the molasses. They lay ladders out and crawl out and get her and pull her out. And Pasquale's body is not found for about a week afterwards. What had happened to him? He had been swept by the wave and by a freight car. There was commercial train traffic on Commercial Street, and he was swept up by a freight car, and his body's found a week later. His dad trudging up and down the waterfront in that time trying to find news about his son. And they finally find his body. They identify him. They're able to identify him only by the fact that his mom had dressed him in 2 sweaters that morning. So they were able to find him. And you learn a little bit about the Italian immigrant experience through the eyes of the kids, of the 2 10-year-olds. You have people who aren't victims who are also important characters in this book. You have a real-life villain in this book. His name is Arthur P. Gell. Anybody know him? Those who have read the book? Arthur P. Gell is the treasurer of U.S. Industrial Alcohol. But he's also the person responsible for overseeing the construction project and the safety of the tank. Only one problem. Has no technical experience, no architectural experience, no construction experience, can't read plans, can't read blueprints, doesn't know anything about a factor of safety, and doesn't ask anyone about that as the tank's being built and after it's completed. But I mean, other than that, right? I'm sure a very, very good financial guy, but the job is way too big for him. So when the steel is delivered for this tank, these are steel plates. This tank's held together with thousands of rivets. When the steel is delivered for the tank, it's below specs. There's no clerk of the works. There's nobody that really inspects it. When he goes to test the tank, he's supposed to, according to specs, fill this 50-foot tank with water to test it for leaks, if not for weight, at least for leaks. And he testifies in court later that he filled this 50-foot tank with about 6 inches of water, took it up past the first angle joint, and pronounced it ready to use. Right? And then when it's in use and it begins to leak, one of the people who works for him, Isaac Gonzales, goes to him several times and warns him that the tank is in danger of collapsing. Gell basically tells Isaac to shut his mouth or he'll lose his job. Gell does have the tank cocked in a very, I'd say, cursory way a couple times. And one time, he has the tank painted from a steel blue color to a brownish red color, a color of molasses, kind of camouflages the leaks down the side. So Gell, I have a tiny bit of sympathy for Gell, I do. He is under enormous pressure with enormous quotas to fulfill. That tank is filled to capacity, 2.3 million gallons of molasses, 6 or 7 times in 1917, 6 times in 1918. The production cycle is intense, and he's responsible for it. But other than that, as you go through the documentation, as you go through the testimony, it's hard to find a lot of redeeming qualities for Gell. So he's an important character in here, and I think a legitimate villain. And I think there's two heroes in this book. Well, Hero 1 and Hero 1A. Hero 1A is Isaac Gonzales. Isaac Gonzales, who worked on the tank's site, who worked for Gel, who is the person who warned Gel. He works on the tank site as a jack of all trades. He helped the ships, the big molasses steamers that came up from Cuba and Puerto Rico and the West Indies, with hundreds of thousands of molasses in their holds, helped them offload it into the tank. And he cleaned up around the tank site, all of that. Isaac's the one that tries to sound the warning. He has premonitions that this tank is going to collapse from what he sees, from what he hears. In fact, Dark Tide opens with a prologue of Isaac running through the streets of the North End at 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning in the summer of 2018 from his apartment in the South End to the tank site on Commercial Street. Runs onto the tank site, runs around the back, opens a valve, lets some molasses out into Boston Harbor, closes the valve, and goes back home. And he testifies in court later that this was his little way of trying to do something to prevent this tragedy. Very stressed by it. Also, by the way, in court, talks about how stressed he is about his marriage because his wife does not believe that's where he's going at 2:30, 3 o'clock. No kidding. Lots of testimony about that. But Isaac tries his best to sound the warning to no avail. He is so anxiety-ridden that in September of 1918, 4 months before the flood, he quits his job, joins the army, does come back to testify in the court case. So Isaac, I think, is this really kind of interesting character, ordinary guy who does his best to try to prevent it. In vain, but nonetheless his best. But I think the real hero of Dark Tide, the real hero of this molasses flood story, is the judge in the case, Hugh W. Ogden. Now, Hugh Ogden is a very well-known Boston attorney, pretty prominent guy, businessman. Superior Court asks him to sit and hear the case. They suggest to him it would probably take about, 6 weeks of his time. It takes 3 years of his time. There are 1,000 witnesses in this case, 1,500 exhibits, 25,000 pages of testimony. The first class action suit, the first suit with the intense use of expert witnesses on both sides, metallurgists, architects, chemists, you name it. Both sides bring out the big guns. And Ogden, I think, does a remarkable job of adjudicating this case, of weighing all the evidence in this case. Now keep in mind, Hugh Ogden is a wealthy guy, prominent lawyer. You know, you'd call him a Boston Brahmin. Would not be hanging around with the plaintiffs in this case, wouldn't socialize with them, they were of a different class. And had he ruled against these plaintiffs, there would not have been any outrage. It would have been, I think, expected almost. Yet, I think he goes out of his way to be fair to the plaintiffs in this case. He always tries to level the playing field between the company and the plaintiffs. My favorite example of that. At one point, Ogden asks the lawyers in the case, would they mind having court in session on Saturday afternoons? Because most of the people who testified are laborers, and they work at least a 5.5-day week. They could maybe get Saturday afternoon to testify. The lawyers say no. By the way, the lawyers on both sides say no. Even the plaintiffs' lawyers say no. They are coming in from out of town. They don't want to come in on the weekends. During the summers, they have summer homes. They don't want to come in on a Saturday. And so Ogden says, okay, fine, in that case, we are going to keep court open until 10 o'clock at night when appropriate. So there's lots of sessions of the molasses flood court case in which testimony is heard up until 10 o'clock at night. So I think he really does perform his job in a professional, honest, compassionate way. Lots of cool things about his character. He's got a legal background, Very strong military background. He was a Judge Advocate General for the highly recognized 42nd Division, known as the Rainbow Division in the First World War, which saw very hard action in France. Ogden over there at the time. I think he brings some of that military code of justice to this case. Religious guy, he's highly placed in the Episcopalian Church. He's the son of a minister. I think he brings some of that, all of that, legal, military, religious, to the way he hears the case. So an interesting character. I've always said somebody should do a biography at some point of Ogden. I think he's an important Boston figure and somebody that we should know more about, even outside of the context of this case, this Molasses flood case. And so that's kind of how I try to put the story together. So I'll bring you up to the day itself, January 15th, 1919. It's about 40 degrees. By the way, 8 degrees warmer than it was when I just got out of my car. I was thinking that. 32, it said on my dashboard. About 40 degrees. 2 days earlier it had been 2 degrees. So it's kind of a January thaw as we know it, right in Boston. Firefighters are playing cards at lunchtime. DPW guys are out walking around. There's deliveries coming, you know, all the time on the waterfront. There's the overhead train trestle, passenger train trestle, the Boston Elevated, which connects South Station and North Station. Trains are going every 7 minutes. I know we should have that today. I know we don't have that today, but we did. All the way up to the Second World War we did. And so that train's going by. There's train traffic on Commercial Street, commercial train traffic. So all that's going on. It's a busy, busy time. And a Boston police patrolman right after lunchtime by the name of Frank McManus is walking his routine beat on Commercial Street and coincidentally making his routine call on the call box back to Boston Police Headquarters. When he hears what he testified later in court, this grinding, rumbling sound and the rat-tat-tat of what sounded like machine gun fire. And he turned around and he saw this molasses tank disintegrating before his eyes, disgorging molasses, the rat-tat-tat of the rivets pulling away from these steel plates as that's happening. And he has the presence of mind to make one of the most unbelievable calls back to Boston Police Headquarters to this day. And what does he say? Send all available rescue personnel immediately. There's a wave of molasses coming down Commercial Street. Guarantee you there has not been a call like that since. That is the official call, by the way. And that molasses comes high, hard, and fast. Now the term "you're as slow as cold molasses in January" does come from this story. However, that molasses comes out at about 35 miles an hour, about 35 feet high at the outset, levels off to about 20 feet high, 160 feet wide, and quite literally scours everything in its path. You need to think of this as almost a small tidal wave. A wave indeed it was. It recoils off Copp's Hill. For those of you who don't know the topography, Copp's Hill slopes downward towards the water. So it can't get into the main part of the north end. If Copp's Hill went the other way, there might have been hundreds or thousands killed. But Copp's Hill acts as like a barrier. It recoils off of it and mostly rumbles southward, past Hanover Street, all the way almost to Battery Street, about a mile along Commercial Street, takes out everything in its path. Takes out people, takes out houses, takes out slaughterhouses across the street, takes domestic animals, the horses, carts. A 2-ton piece of the tank severs the main support trestle of the Boston Elevated. A train had just rounded the bend. When the trestle is severed, the train jumps the track. The conductor gets out of his vestibule, makes his way across tangled wreckage, and stops a second train from plunging to the tracks below. The entire North End Commercial Street waterfront is obliterated. That North End paving yard is gone. The firehouse gets knocked off of its foundation. the stables. 25 horses die, along with those 21 people. About half of them die essentially on the impact of the wave and the debris that the wave carries. The other half shot to death by Boston police that night when all is quiet on the waterfront because they are so enmeshed in their molasses, they can't get out. So there's gunshot fire reverberating around the harbor as these horses are put out of their misery. Pretty amazing kind of day. The first rescue people are sailors that are on ships in the harbor, moored in the harbor. They do their best. Firefighters come along quickly too. As I said, they put ladders out to crawl onto the molasses to pull people or bodies from the flood. Victims are taken by ambulance to the nearby Haymarket Relief Station, which is right about where Haymarket Station is now, T Station is now. Adjunct facility to Boston City Hospital at the time. An almost surreal scene at the hospital. Doctors and nurses are covered with molasses as victims are brought in, gurneys, molasses on them. Doctors and nurses can't even tell if the victims are men or women in many cases at first until molasses is removed from their clothing, from their face, from their breathing passages. And people are taken there with some terrible injuries, fractured skulls, broken backs, broken pelvises. These are people who were either hit by the wave outright or slammed by wood, by steel, by wagon wheels, by anything else that gets scooped up in the wave. So when you first hear about this disaster, you wonder, do I take this seriously? It's molasses. The substance itself kind of produces like a little bit of disbelief. But these people really suffer terrible injuries and terrible ways to die. And as you're reading about it, when you're reading the evidence, when you're reading the court case, it really hits home at that point. I tried to bring that out with the Dark Tide narrative as a result. The cleanup actually starts that afternoon. And firefighters first put their hoses, hook up their hoses to hydrants, and they douse it with municipal water, but it doesn't do much. The molasses is kind of heavy, viscous, it's congealed. Doesn't actually harden, but it's very difficult to wash away. By the next day, even though it doesn't harden, people are out there with picks and chisels trying to figure things out. How do we do this? Finally, one enterprising firefighter has the idea that maybe salt water from Boston Harbor, the brine of salt water, would cut the molasses and allow it to be washed away. And that's exactly what they do. They pump millions of gallons of water out of Boston Harbor and wash a huge amount of the molasses away, most of it back into the harbor. The harbor is stained brown for weeks after. I had one lady at a presentation ask me, how long would the cleanup take if there was an EPA then? It's a good question. Good question. I don't know the answer to that. But as it is in the North End, the entire cleanup is done in about 6 months. Not bad. And that's everything. That includes the rebuilding of that overhead train trestle, by the way. As I said, that doesn't come down until the Second World War. I said to my wife, 6 months of chaos, but they really get it done. I live in Weymouth. The Four River Bridge took 5 years to do. What's up? But in any case, they do get that North End area back to normal in about 6 months. One more thing, and then I want to open it up to your questions. So people say to me, what's the long-standing ramification of this story? It's an interesting story. There's good drama. There's a tragedy. There's strong characters. There's big history. But what stays with us today? And I pointed out that fourth big thing was just the relationship between government and business. I think that's the major piece. But I think the subset of that we can all relate to, like almost on a daily basis, in whether you live in a small town or you live in a large city, is that all of the building construction standards that we take for granted today, that architects need to show their work, that engineers need to sign and seal their plans, that building inspectors need to come out and look at projects, and sign off on projects. All of those things come about as a direct result of the Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919. Think about this. This tank did not even require a building permit at the time because it was considered a receptacle and not a building. Think about that. But so all of those things we take for granted in the building construction industry start here after the Great Boston Molasses Flood in Massachusetts and ripple across the country very, very quickly. I use as my analogy that the Great Boston Molasses Flood did for building construction standards what the Coconut Grove fire several years later did for fire standards. So you have these two Boston disasters and tragedies that I think at least have some positive, long-standing ramifications. So I'll say with that, thank you very much for that part. Thank you. Let me take a sip of water, and then we'll get to your questions. And if I can hear the questions, I'll repeat them, so you don't have to strain. All right, so just make sure I hear them and I'll repeat them, and let's go. Who's first? I'm going to take this lady right here because the front row gets the second question. Yes.
Whatever interested you in writing this book? I remember going to the North End as a kid, and my dad would say, "Can you smell the sweetness?" And that was like in the 40s.
Okay, so two questions. Let me break that down to two questions. What interested me in writing about it, and how long could you smell the molasses for, which is a great question. So the first answer, what interested me? I first came across the flood story when I got my master's in history. I did my master's on Italian immigration, my heritage. I'm the grandson of 3 Italian immigrants. And I used the North End as a focal point. So it was kind of a US-wide look at immigration with the North End as a focal point. I went through hundreds of naturalization petitions and ships manifests and all that as part of my research. But I came across the flood story then. And I said, wow, I have to do a little more research on that. It's kind of interesting. So what's the first thing you do when you research is you look for a book on the topic. Guess what? No books on the topic. By the way, now, just one book on the topic, in case you're wondering. So I'm thinking, okay, this is interesting. Let me check newspapers, see what was up with that. I checked the Boston newspapers. There were 7 at the time. And every single one of them had this molasses flood story on the front page for like a week. And they knocked off the front page the Prohibition Amendment, which was ratified the night of the molasses flood, by the way, prohibition to go into effect 1 year later, and the Versailles peace talks to end World War I, kind of interesting, and lots of pages of coverage inside. There was these little feature stories all through these papers. In fact, my favorite little feature story was a headline that read, "Lynn, lawyer, not killed in molasses flood." Apparently there was rumors that he was, and he like on day 3 or 4 that story appeared. He wanted that verified that he was alive. But in any case, I thought, wow, this is pretty impressive. There's a lot going on with this piece. Now we have to go find some primary sources for it. And I started to look. I found one that had been used before, which was Hugh W. Ogden's summary of the case. It's about a 65-page summary. He's a very good writer. He deals with all these major issues we talked about tonight, so I thought that was great. But I needed to find more. So I had a tremendous assist from a Superior Court archivist, and she found me the damage awards in the case, which damage awards are these vignettes, these stories about how the person was injured or killed. How many children do they have? What did they do for work? How much do they earn? It all goes into determining how much money they receive, right? But so I had like 119 little stories, and I broke the seal on those records. They had been dormant for for 75 years. So that was kind of fun to break those, and I thought, wow, I'm close, but not quite there yet. And I said to the archivist, I keep seeing this reference to 25,000 pages of court testimony. Lizzie, we have to find that testimony. And she said, don't get your hopes up, it could be lost to history, I'll look, blah, blah, blah. So I'm in a library now, right? I've probably dealt with 100 librarians and archivists in my author career. They're all like great people. They're the most earnest people. They'll do anything for you. You need help finding something, they'll like spend hours finding it. Archivists, I think, as a general rule, tend to be more low-key, kind of even-keeled. They find eureka stuff all the time, right? So they're not impressed. So one August morning, she calls me at home and says, you know that 25,000 pages of testimony I've been looking for in the Molasses flood case? I said, yes. She said, I found it. I said, I'm not very even-keeled. I was like, whoa, hello. She said, yes, it's at the Social Law Library and Government Center. They're expecting your call. So I got in there quickly, I think the next day, maybe that afternoon. I probably read about 20,000 pages of testimony. And it's just a great primary source. You have under oath, when I think being under oath really meant something, it was really important. Well, what I mean by that is, when you read this testimony, it's all very candid kind of, yes, no, I did, this is what happened. Very little buck passing, very little I don't recalls, For example, there was this one example where Gell is under oath. He's being deposed pretty hard by the plaintiff's lawyer about not filling that tank with water. And they said, Mr. Gell, you only filled it with 6 inches of water. Why? And he said, well, a decision was made. We had neither the time nor the money to fill it, to the top. And the plaintiff's lawyer asks, a very good question that all lawyers would ask, by whom was the decision made? And Gell said, by me. And I said, I think in 2019 that would not be the answer. The answer would be, I don't recall. It was kind of this committee, type of thing, et cetera, et cetera. So it's this really good primary source. You have company officials, city officials, experts on both sides, family members of the deceased, victims, injured, all of that, all under oath. And so a lot of Dark Tide, when you read it, you'll see, Dark Tide's divided into 3 parts: before the flood, and after the flood. Part 3 is the only part with courtroom scenes, but lots of the narrative is drawn from court testimony. So Isaac Gonzales running through the streets of the North End is derived and drawn mostly from that court testimony. So that's a long answer to your, how did I get interested? It was that way. Can you still smell the molasses, or how long could you smell the molasses? Question 2. You cannot still smell it today. on a warm day, hot day, rainy day, snowy day, sunny day, windy day, whatever, you cannot. I've been down there on all of those days. But however, you could smell it for years after. And I think that's where the folklore kind of builds about that you could still smell it today. You could smell it for years, even decades after. So did you say your dad, in the 40s? Yeah. So I have no problem believing that. I had a gentleman who came to one of my presentations who said in the 50s and 60s, late 50s, early 60s, he was a meter reader for Boston Gas. And when he went down in the basements of those buildings across the street, all of which had filled all the way up to the first floor with molasses, right? The basements were filled. He said you could still smell molasses, and I certainly can believe that. So you could smell it for years afterwards. So. Okay, long answer. Now I promised this woman in the front row.
My question was just answered.
Her question was just answered. Excellent. Awesome, I like when that happens. So let's go as far back as we can, and that, I think, is you, sir. Yes?
Do you know who the lawyers were in the cases, who represented the company, the owners and builders of the tank, and...
Yeah, and the plaintiffs. Yeah, well, I can tell you the lead lawyers off the top. The lead lawyer is Charles Choate for the defense, and Damon Hall, a lawyer from Belmont, very prominent lawyer, kind of a street fighting lawyer. Did not join forces to become Choate, Hall, and Stewart. That's a different Hall. But Damon Hall was the lawyer for the plaintiffs, and I had the real pleasure of developing a little bit of a relationship and communications with Damon Hall's he had 5 granddaughters, with his granddaughters who had heard the story but didn't really know a lot about his role in it, and he was a good, tough, hard lawyer on behalf of his plaintiffs, took the case pro bono, essentially. And his granddaughter said that that's just the kind of guy he was. You know, he's just one of those stand-up guys, and they weren't surprised by his role. Yeah, good question. Yeah, yes, ma'am.
You said someone should write a book about Ogden.
I said somebody should write maybe some kind of biography about Ogden. Yeah, I just think he's that kind of guy.
What your next book is about.
So I can't quite tell you what the next book is. The question is, what's my 7th book about? I can just tell you it's close to being, to me being able to tell you. I have to just finalize a couple things.
It's not about Ogden.
It's not about Ogden. That I can tell you. I'm happy to tell you it's not about Ogden, or at least I can tell you that much. But I will tell you this seriously, and lots of people are on my mailing list. I have a little sign-up sheet out here. If you want to just put your email address down, I'll add you to it, and when it's time to announce, you'll be one of the first few thousand who know. So, yes, and by the way, one thing about the email list, I do like 2 or 3 e-blasts a year. So I had a woman at a presentation say to me, you know, I signed up for Williams-Sonoma, and they send me an email every day. And I don't have time or inclination to do that. So yeah, I will not spam you every day. You'll get maybe 3 a year, possibly a 4th. That's unusual. So just to let you know that. Yeah, yes, sir.
What was the company found guilty of exactly?
Yeah, so what were they found?
Negligence,
Yeah, what were they found guilty of? So let's talk about when you say guilty, right? They were found liable. It's a civil case, not a criminal case. The only reason I make that distinction is there was a grand jury that sat on this case, returns no indictments. And I think probably appropriately so. You know, there's a lot of scolding going on, but I'm not sure any laws were actually broken because there weren't laws. So they were found liable of, yes, negligence. That's what they were found liable of. And Ogden, you know, when he announces his decision, says basically, you put on a very spirited defense, Brother Choate, regarding the anarchist defense. The only thing you were lacking was evidence, you know, which I thought was kind of an interesting comment, but he's very clear. And I think USIA basically has little else to go on. I think that's why Choate takes that approach. And by the way, it is a very strong, eloquent, circumstantial defense. Pretty interesting hearing him making the arguments. But Ogden's right. That's the only thing he was lacking. I saw somebody. Yes, sir, right there, in the middle. Yeah.
Could you explain the geography of the tank, the waterfront, and the neighborhood, and whether or not any molasses went directly into the water?
So, the geography of the tank, neighborhood, water, etc. The tank is 220 feet from the inner harbor. If you know the North End, it's down near the bocce courts and the softball baseball field. It's right there. There's an 8-inch square plaque that's in a 3-foot concrete wall on Commercial Street that marks the spot. It's pretty much exact. So it's 220 feet from the water. That gave it's the inner harbor, I think you'd call it. That gave the steamers this perfect place to kind of pull up, offload their molasses. Think of this tank as a holding tank. The molasses was transferred as needed to USIA's distilling plant, which was in East Cambridge, kind of near the Leechmere section of Cambridge. So about a mile away, you know, right past Leverett Circle, right over there was by train, by oil car. That's how it was transported there. So it was a really great spot, great, you know, place for production. So it's about 80 feet, as I say, from the firehouse. The firehouse was right out on the pier. Had a fire boat, and it was responsible basically for fires in the harbor. And so Copp's Hill, as I said, slopes down toward the water, towards the tank. So the wave recoils off of Copp's Hill and goes right down Commercial Street. The heart of the North End is kind of on the other side of Copp's Hill. So if Copp's Hill sloped the other way, the deluge would have gone right into the neighborhood, you know, into the heart of the neighborhood, which does not happen. Now, the other piece of folklore that's grown up about the molasses flood is what? That molasses completely covered the entire city of Boston, from like Commercial Street to Hyde Park. And so like any good folklore, there's some truth in, you know, a little bit of truth in all good folklore, right? And the reason for that is molasses was tracked all over the city. It was tracked on subways. It was reported on payphones. earpieces and mouthpieces of payphones. I had a high school class say, "What's a payphone?" No. Just they kind of all did that. You know. It was tracked in horse troughs all over the city. You know, municipal horses drank from water troughs around the city. So that's where kind of that folklore comes. But the swath of the Molasses, most of it goes southward on Commercial Street. A little bit goes northward. But again, the geography of that area, there's a big bend in Commercial Street northward where there's a skating rink. It kind of prevents most of it from going up that way. So most of it heads south and, as you say, into the harbor itself. So it kind of, think of it, this thing is disintegrating across, I say 160 feet wide. That's a wide swath. Yeah. Is that good? Yes, okay. I'm going to do one more in the back, then come to you in the red shirt. Yes, ma'am.
Did any of the owners or executives of that company, did they have any offices on site?
Right. The question is, yep, did any owners or executives of the company have offices on site? No. Isaac was on site. Occasionally, Isaac had a little assistant, custodian type person on site. The local offices for USIA were in Cambridge at the distilling plant. And USIA has plants up and down the East Coast and tanks up and down the East Coast. Baltimore, Virginia Beach, Cape May, Brooklyn. So they're a big company, big industrial alcohol company with lots of molasses tanks. But no, the offices, if you will, were at the distilling plant in Cambridge. Yes, sir.
How heavy is a gallon of molasses?
How heavy is a gallon of molasses? I don't know the exact weight of it, but I think it's eight times heavier than water. Yeah. Yes, I think that's about, I think I'm right about that. It's yeah, it's enormously heavy. Yeah. Does this gentleman know? Were you going to say you know, sir? Oh, then I'll come to you. Then hold on for a second. In fact, one of the things that they point out about the 2.3 million gallons, the capacity, is it's about 26 million pounds. There you go. Well, there you go. Can you figure it out that way? 2.3 million gallons? Yes, you can. So, yes, so there you go. 26 million pounds, about 13,000 Ford automobiles of the day, Model T Fords. 13,000 times 2,000, is that 26 million? Yes. Damon Hall points that out in the court case, that the weight was about 13,000 Ford automobiles. So that gives you an idea of what's kind of encapsulated in that. Sir, way back, yes.
Two questions. Was there only one chamber in the tank? And how did they pump the molasses from the ship to the tank?
Yeah, so two questions. Was there only one chamber in the tank? Yes. In fact, to sort of the science of the tank, if you will, so cold molasses sat in the tank. When a delivery of warm molasses comes up, and this is what happened, it was probably about 2 days before the tank collapsed, there was a 700,000 gallon delivery. Molasses is offloaded in the pipe and it's heated along the way to allow it to flow. And the intake pipe goes into the bottom of the tank. So when that warm molasses hits the cold molasses, there is a fermentation process, there's a gas process, and it's designed to, the gas is designed to escape through these manhole covers, they call them, vent pipes, on the top of the tank. Sometimes, though, the cold molasses acts as a little bit of a tamp and doesn't allow it to escape, and more pressure is put on the outside wall. Because this tank, no one's surprised by that tamp, that comes out in court, that's common and normal. That's why you have to build the tank strong in a better way. But because this tank was not built well, that pressure on the outside walls finally causes it to give way. How about right behind you, there's a guy, and then you, yes. Because you were at Boston Public Library the other night, you can wait. No, I'm only kidding. Yes. Yes.
What were the damages that the people that had severe injuries, what was the total damages?
Yep.
And did the company actually pay it?
Yes. What were the damages? Did the company pay it, et cetera, et cetera? Yes. So the damages. Ogden first, there's a couple things about damages. One of the things Ogden points out before he gives them is that these are not wealthy people. They are people of the working class. That's how you figure damage awards. So he tries to be really conservative, I think, in his awards. So for people who were killed immediately, like Maria DeStasio's family, the award was about $6,000, which would be about $600,000 today. Do that math. And if you suffered before you died, like George Leahy under the firehouse, about $7,500. Okay, so $750,000 today. Now, Damon Hall is very happy with Ogden's decision, not so happy with the damage awards. He threatens to take USIA to a jury, before a jury. And USIA goes behind closed doors with him, and they come out with and pay about twice as much, double what Ogden originally granted. Total amount is about $630,000, which they do pay. It's not insured. They take it as a charge on their balance sheet in 1926. The two biggest plaintiffs in the case, City of Boston for the North End paving yard, Boston Elevated for the overhead train trestle. Yes, sir.
Now, when Isaac would dump molasses into the harbor, there's no records and volumes and accounting?
No. So when Isaac would dump molasses, was there any record or volume or anything like that? No, nothing like that. In fact, that question does come up in the court. Jell talks about being completely unaware of that was going on. And there was a guard posted at night, not the whole time, but a little bit later. In fact, I think right after the U.S. gets into the war, because the tank starts production in January of 1916. I think once the U.S. gets into the war, there's a guard placed there, and Isaac just flashes his pass, that he works there, and goes and does his thing. Yeah. Not, again, I think, we're kind of thinking of today, that could never, somebody would be like, what's going on? Yeah, so.
Molasses, by the way, is about 16 pounds per gallon.
Oh, excellent. Did you just do that math, or okay. Excellent. Oh, there you go. Excellent. Thank you for that. Excellent. Yes. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for coming. This is awesome.
Oh, good. She said, thank you for coming. This is awesome. No, that's not fine. Sorry. Go ahead.
I work in interior design, and I'm well aware of architectural codes and building codes and everything that came out of all this. I wondered if you happen to know if OSHA was also born out of this.
Was OSHA born out of this? I don't think so. I don't know exactly when OSHA was born. I feel like OSHA or a previous iteration probably came out of the Roosevelt administration. That's my gut feeling. I don't know it for sure. What's that? Well, OSHA itself. Yeah, but I'm saying maybe there's a previous iteration of OSHA, the kind of thing that we're talking about. My guess is it's later. Yeah. Later than the flood. Yeah. Hold on one second in case someone who hasn't asked wants to ask. Do we have any first-time questioners? Yes, sir.
With all the other tanks up and down the coast, were there any other problems with the tanks?
Yeah, so with all the other tanks up and down the coast, were there any other problems? So there's no problems with the tanks per se. USIA does have two of its ships sink at sea through some kind of unknown causes. Nobody knows what causes it, molasses ships. And fire is set to its Brooklyn plant shortly after the Boston molasses flood. Kind of a mystery. Nobody knows why. Was there arson? Was there insurance? Don't know. But one of the points that Charles Choate makes is kind of what you're getting at, I think, or maybe not, but Charles Choate points out that there weren't any problems at these other tanks, and in fact there was a 3 million gallon tank in Baltimore, and that was fine. So of course anarchists blew it up. That was kind of one of the arguments that he makes. Yeah, it's good. Okay, sir, now you, the repeat. Oh, what?
The gentleman in front of me asked my question.
Oh, okay, good. Yes, way in the back, yeah.
Well, I was just thinking about when the tank fell apart, was it all the sides let go at once, or was it like spilling over from all?
Yeah, so the question is like kind of how did it disintegrate? Yes, you have it right. It kind of disintegrates, as you say, all at once. The roof of the tank, to give you an idea, the roof of the tank just kind of lands not too far from where it was. But the thing literally pulls apart. So this is called lap joint construction, which is kind of built like this, one piece over the other and held together with rivets. The rivets aren't plumb. They're done in this really quick, fast manner by really unskilled people. And so it's just not built well. And it literally does kind of tear away like that. Yeah. Good question. All right. This is a pretty smart group. Thanks for the great questions. Really appreciate it. And I'll be out here. Thanks.